Other-Terrestrial, Season 1, Episode 2, Vitriol, by Nolan Conray.
Computers now have primary control.
Dad! Dad! Early pushed out of his seat. The panic in his daughter's voice was something serious. Not a bumped head, not in jest. There was a problem. What is it? He demanded. Lieutenant Pira and Commander Sens are back. He's hurt, Anna said, fear and panic in her voice. Early pushed off the deck past her and into the hall. There was already a crowd, and he saw Sens being helped along by a crew member. His suit was gone. He looked dry as bone, and Early felt a stab of horror as he saw the massive chunk of his side that was missing. Pira was leaning against the wall, waving away another crew member who was trying to help her. Just help Sens, she said. She looked exhausted, battered and bruised, but not seriously injured. Pira! Alexander shoved through the crowd in his haste to reach her, and when she saw him, her eyes lit up. She said nothing, merely throwing her arms around him. Oh God, I was so worried, he said, embracing her. We should have gone to Axis, she said, a true but weary smile on her face. Early pushed in toward Sens. Let me through, I can assist, he said. Brooks appeared as Early hooked his arm under Sens's other side. There was some dampness left in the crevices of his body, but it didn't seem good. His polyps looked like the color had drained from them. System, begin filling medical tub A with a saline solution for a coral, he ordered. Pira came alongside, still watching Sens. He's been out of his suit for a few hours now. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure how long. I'll have to check my system. She sounded like she blamed herself, and Early nodded to her. You did good work bringing him back, Pira. She glanced towards the airlock. Kel was standing there, watching him passively. The ambassador saved our lives, she said. We wouldn't have made it back without him. Early said no more, continuing on with Sens. As they brought the being into the medical bay, the tub was already half filled. Even in the low gravity, it was tricky getting Sens into the tank, but they managed. As the medicated water went over his body, he saw the polyps begin to move. But it was only the flow of water that was doing it. He still was not sure if the being was even alive. Sir, the medical orderly said, I think we've got life signs. Early slowly let out his held breath. Track the numbers. I want every last polyp accounted for. As the orderly went to work, Early crouched next to the tank, looking in his side. His own sensors could not tell much about Sens. He never had seen the being like this. He'd always seemed huge in his hulking, water-filled suit. But now, outside of it, he could see each chunk of rock held together by strange pink strands that he knew served as the muscle fibers of his body. And he looked so small. Pira felt drained. She felt shocked that she had made it. Her guard didn't want to drop. Somewhere along the way, she had accepted her death as inevitable. Alexander still held her, his presence a comfort. She was shivering slightly, a reaction to adrenal letdown that many species shared. But her duty wasn't done yet. She had to tell the captain. "I have to make a report," she told Alexander, slipping from his grip. "Pyrrha, you need medical attention," he said, alarmed. And right, she knew. "This is more important," she told him, meeting his gaze. He stared back into her eyes, and she knew that on some level he would never understand her, nor she him. There was just too much distance. Alexander nodded. He did not understand her, but he respected her. It was enough. She moved away, glad they were in 0G. She wasn't sure she could walk right now in full gravity. Alexander kept watching her until she rounded the corner. The captain had gone down towards the med center. A shadow loomed over her, and she nearly jumped. It was Kel. "You did not abandon him," the ambassador said. "Why?" It took her a moment to realize that it meant Sens. "I won't abandon anyone if I have a choice," she replied. There was nothing on the ambassador's face to read. Was Kel really that mercenary? Would he have simply left a dying comrade? But then, he had showed up for them. She didn't know what to make of that. Looking at him, she could only think of the violence he'd left in his wake. "I am impressed," the ambassador said as he turned and drifted away. Pyrrha watched after the being for a moment, forcing herself to move again. Entering the med center, she saw Brooks standing out of the way as Early and the medical team tried to save the commander's life. She forced herself to ignore it. She couldn't do anything else for Sens right now. "Captain," she said, "I have to report to you what we saw." Brooks looked her over. "Are you in a condition to—" "They were trying to kill us," she said quickly. "I have evidence and there's more." Brooks' expression went grim. "Step into the conference room and tell me everything." Apollonia felt light-headed as the aide told her to follow him. He was grim, and she wondered if the thing had spoken to her honestly, if it had even gotten a chance to talk to Captain Brooks. Maybe she was being taken to the airlock. The governor might be wanting to kill her rather than let her go. Lord knew the man had hated her from the moment she'd come onto the station. It was the same everywhere she'd been, though. People disliked her from the moment they met her. Just something about her. No matter how much she tried to overcome it, once people made their judgments, they were hard to change. They came to a juncture. To take the left path would lead to the more public docking stations. The right would lead to the more deserted airlocks, where she could be disposed of quietly. Part of her wanted to fight, to not go down easily. But enough of her still wanted it to be over, to let the end come. She wouldn't have the will to fight hard, to the bitter end. She was almost disappointed as they went left. Moments after, she felt a burning sense of fear that left her knees weak. The possibility of her own end was overwhelming, and yet it had been averted. She heard a sound and looked over. She often heard them, but they were nothing, a literal figment of her mind. But this time it was real. It was a person noticing her. He dropped the box he was carrying and had floated into the wall. He was just staring at her. Another man stopped, looking first to him quizzically, but then his gaze was drawn to her. He leaned in to whisper something to his friend. It didn't even surprise her at this point. She smiled to them, a smile laced with threat, and they wilted away. At least that part was amusing, until people started throwing stones. They were now in one of the busier parts of the station, an area she rarely had frequented. The brightness was exotic to her, and she looked around. Would the ship that Brooks commanded be like the colony? Smaller, maybe? The aide stopped. "My instructions are to take you to this ship and observe you boarding. You are not to return to the colony." He regarded her with a confused look. Part of him seemed to be drawn to her. Another part seemed revolted. "What about my belongings?" she asked. "I was not informed of—" "I'm kidding. I don't own a damn thing." She gave the man a look up and down. "Don't worry. I'm never coming back to this shithole again." She went towards the ship, or rather, the docking hatch. The ship itself was on the other side of a thick wall that protected them all from the vacuum of the dock. The image of it was just projected. It wasn't a big ship at all. Did they really want her to live on that thing? Going up to the airlock hatch, she wondered what she was supposed to do. A voice came out. "Identify yourself," a computer said. I'm Apollonia Nor. The captain is expecting me." "You are not on the itinerary. One moment." The airlock door opened almost immediately, surprising her. But then she realized just what it was that had opened the door. The thing that called itself Kel stood there, watching her impassively. "Are you going to let me in?" she asked. He was blocking the way. Without a word, the being turned and moved back in. It didn't push off anything. It simply moved. The body was an illusion. Real and physical constructions, yet a lie. The true thing, the Shoggoth, was nothing like it. Slowly, she followed. The airlock door behind her closed and the one at the other end opened. Brooks was there, looking surprised. "Thank you, Ambassador," he said with a surprising calm to the being. Part of her wanted to scream to him that he should be afraid of that thing, not act nice to it. But she didn't voice the words. Too many people had said things like that about her for it to ever sit right with her. "Captain," she said, "I was brought here. Am I now your prisoner?" "No," Brooks assured her. "There's no evidence to make any charges of murder stick in a real court. The governor has asked that we take you off this colony, and we will do that. If you then decide you do not wish to join my ship's crew, then we will be fine dropping you off wherever you wish when we next make port." She wasn't sure she believed that. People generally were not this nice, unless they were pretending. "All right," she said. "I'll come along." It wasn't like she had a choice. The only sounds in the med lab were the whirring of water in the medical tank. Sens was in there still, unmoving. At least his limbs, at least a few of his polyps, were now moving in a way that seemed healthy. Their color had even started to return. But he still didn't know if that meant much. Sens' species required a certain number of polyps to be alive and aware, to actually achieve a complex level of consciousness. Alone, each polyp was only a fraction of a being. If most of the polyps didn't survive, then would that be the end of their science officer? He had no idea, and he hated that. Their medical records were dense and complex. It was so rare that a human ever needed to deal with them in this way that there just hadn't been a lot made available and digestible. He would just have to rely on the medical computer. It was not Dr. Y, though, and for a moment he wished the laws of the Sapient Union were more lenient on artificial intelligences like their doctor. He'd give half his augments just for the doctor's consultation right now. But that wasn't an option, and he would just have to work with what he had on hand. He was doing his best, but the familiar old shame of inadequacy haunted him. He should be better than this. He'd pushed himself all his life to be the best he could be. He'd sacrificed half of his biological body to better himself. And yet here he sat again, feeling it hadn't been enough. Quadruple checking Sens and then all the medical systems, he knew that he was still on duty as shift officer. Absently, he began to look over the sensor logs, hoping for the vast quantities of data to scrub his mind of his own feelings. The computers did this automatically, sorting what seemed relevant from what was extraneous. Who needed to know about vacuum purity logs? He did, of course. He much preferred to take in the raw data logs and let his own personal filters sort them. And he set a different bar for relevancy. Many things the computer did not consider important to share, he'd look at. Better to be sure. He had the processing power for it. He caught an odd fluctuation. The vacuum outside the ship had registered spikes of gas. That typically meant an airlock leaking, but this was on the outer side of the vessel, away from the airlock. Focusing on that, Early saw that the spikes of gas density, when traced back along a path, occurred in a line along the side of the hull. But they stopped just around halfway down her length. After that, just short little bursts, before heading back. That would only match a person or drone operating a thruster system. But they were in private docking, and the system was set to warn him of any being approaching the ship like that. Quickly, he flipped through the logs, searching for any relevant information. Then he jumped out of his chair. "Captain, he said over an open channel. Someone's put something on our hull. Brooks came back a moment later. Repeat? Are we under attack? Don't know, Captain. Someone got into our system somehow. They used a flaw in our hardware to file a standard hard vac inspection ticket, but got it marked as unimportant so our system didn't inform us. They stopped at our midline, and when they left, I believe they were lighter, like they left something behind. Brooks came back. Can you send a drone? If they were this good, I think they'd be ready for that. I want to check it personally. Brooks considered. Do it, he said. Take someone else rated for this kind of work with you. I'm sorry to have to pull you along on this, Pyrrha, Early said over the comm. But you're the only one on the ship besides the captain that's rated for an emergency vacuum excursion. No need to apologize, sir, Pyrrha replied. Moth owls didn't get bags under their eyes, but she managed to look exhausted all the same. But she'd taken a stim shot, and he knew she was ready for what came. They floated quickly and purposefully around the hurricane. She was only 70 meters in length, but she felt much bigger right now. His sensors told him that he was at the location the sensor logs had noted. If they had attached a device, it had to be around there. He saw it. It was set into a sunken line on the ship's hull, where it wouldn't be easily noticed. It was made of a dull gray metal that looked innocuous enough, but the case was big enough to hold a tracker unit or hide a sizable explosive charge. Here, he said, extending his sensors cautiously. He couldn't be sure how smart the device was, and if it would react to being scanned. He stuck to passive sensors. Even so, a flood of information filled his vision. Ambient particles would have diffused to undetectable levels, and he focused his observations on the hull around the area. He found residue there. Just a small amount, but it was conclusive. High explosives. But his sensors didn't detect a complex computer in it. There weren't enough electromagnetic emissions. It wasn't smart. The opposite. It was as dumb as could be. Open-bottomed, not sealed, and the explosive had been adhered to the hull. Utmost secrecy, he thought. The dumber it was, the less evidence there would be, both prior to planting and after detonation. Traces of a high explosive, Pyrrha said. An unstable compound. It will go off once it decays enough. I think so, Early said. So we're on a timetable. Can't be sure how soon, but it won't be more than a few hours. Unstable compounds are also used to help hide evidence, she noted. It might decay before an investigation could find it. Point being, there might be other things that can set it off. We can't assume it's just relying on decay. Understood, he said. Captain, I recommend evacuating the ship. Chance of a decompression are significant. We have an explosive here. In progress, Brooks replied. But we can't risk moving Sens yet. Do you think you can remove it? Pyrrha asked. I'm not sure, he replied. Do you have any expertise in this? I have training in bomb removal or disposal, but on the stims I've got shaking hands. She made a sound of exasperation. Who uses dumb bombs anymore? This is like something from an old war. Yeah, Early said, and I think meant to look like the ship had just suffered an accident when it went off. Pyrrha studied it for a moment, looking along the ship. I agree, but it's not important right now. Do you want me to take over? No, Early said. He put his hands over the case lightly. I'm better equipped. His suit did not cover his hands. They were both mechanical. They normally had a tactile sense better than normal flesh could ever manage, but he'd had to turn that off due to the numbing cold of space. The tips of his fingers opened, and tiny extendable limbs came out, moving around the edges. It was attached expertly, fused to the hull. I'll have to cut it away, he noted. If they were skilled enough to pull that other trick, then I think they'll have anti-tamper sensors inside the case, Pierre noted. Try cutting off a corner. Even in elite circles, they don't often extend the sensors that far. Often, Early said. A bead of sweat broke free from his face as he spoke, the perfect sphere floating loose in his mask. He ignored it. Any wrong move and they'd both die. His children would probably die. The captain, Pierre's husband, everyone with them. Sens, if he'd had a chance of recovery, it would be stolen from him. He fought down his nerves. He knew he could do this. Drilling into the case carefully, he made a tiny hole and inserted a sensor. It was so minuscule as to be nearly invisible to a standard human eye. "Don't let it touch anything," Pierce said. "Can't be sure which parts are sensors." Understood. He could see a grainy image through his tiny sensor. Scanning the interior with the barest of touches, he could make out a charge, the unstable explosive. There was enough to blast a substantial hole in the ship, shaped in a way that would make it look enough like a standard outblowing that could go unnoticed. Certainly the governor's people would never be able to tell. Hell, they probably planted it. That idea bothered him on many levels, but he didn't stop to dwell on them now. There was a component he couldn't identify yet. A timer. Damn it. They hadn't left anything to chance. They likely expected a very specific time frame here, and decay bombs could vary by nearly 100 minutes each way. He carefully extended in another probe, but it was all he could fit through the drill hole. The side seemed rigged, and it was a miracle he hadn't set it off already. His new probe connected to the timer carefully, picking up its ambient charges. In moments it pieced together a decent view of what was occurring inside. "We have less than 1 minute," he said. His breathing sounded overwhelming in his ears. Pierre's voice stayed calm, collected, and he found himself marveling at her. "Captain, you get that? Expedite the evacuation." "Understood," Brooks replied. All Early could hear was his own heart pounding in his ears. "I can connect to it," he said. "Going to attempt to reset its timer. Buy us some time." "No way to just sever the connection?" Pierre asked. "Turn it off?" "It's got anti-tamper sensors, basic passive things all over the place. I'm going to need more time to deactivate them." The words came out, but his mind was focused on this. 45 seconds. He connected to the timer and found that his number was correct, but still ticking down. There was no intelligence in this, but any extra charge he put in to give commands might set it off. He couldn't go that route. 30 seconds. If he disabled the sensor, he could do whatever he wanted with the rest of it. He just had to get the one. He even knew the kind. He'd used them before. Top of the line, incredibly resilient against tamper. Simple as all hell. Tough to trick, but not impossible. 15 seconds. He had to go for it. He needed a different tool, but there was no chance he'd get it in position in time. Using his second probe, he slipped it up against the sensor gently. Had to be careful. 10 seconds. "Run," he grit out to Pyrrha. "No time," she replied. He attempted to send in a jolt to overload it, just enough to disable it and stop its own sensing. There was a sweet spot in there that he knew from experience would burn it out. It tripped. He'd sent in too much. He let out a gasp and jerked back. The bomb didn't explode. He opened his eyes to see that he was still looking at the ship itself, and the ugly brick of a bomb that had nearly killed them all. "Sir? Sir," Pierre said. "You shut it off." "No," Early answered her, a bitter taste in his mouth. "I didn't. We just got lucky." "The detonator broke," Early said. "I've never seen it happen before. This is a high-quality piece of tech, but it split in half and just couldn't set off the detonation signal. I could have blasted it with a plasma torch and it wouldn't have cared." Brooks studied the components from the disassembled bomb that Early had set out on the table. The timer, the sensors, the decomposing explosive, now rendered inert in water. "Can we trace it to the governor?" he asked. "You think he planted it?" Early asked. "Possibly. Can we trace it to him?" Early took a deep breath. "Honestly, Captain, I can't see them pulling this off. Everything about this was done expertly, from the hack that got them close to the bomb itself. This is like Black Ops level stuff." He shook his head. "We should never have gotten this lucky." "We didn't know who our enemy was," Brooks said. "We still don't," Logus commented, frowning. "But we know that they're professionals, not just angry colonials," Early replied. "It's a good point, Captain. I apologize for letting it happen on my watch." "Not necessary," Brooks replied. He gave his executive commander a smile. "We wouldn't have even known about it if not for you." "I promise you they won't be able to pull the same trick twice," Early said. "Good. Now get me any forensics you can off this and report as soon as you know. Yes, sir. Brooks stood and left the room. Logus followed him. What now, Captain? The psychiatrist asked. Brooks looked back at the man. It's time to confront the governor.